diversity. Um, all this semester, I hope that you've been paying attention to media outlets and advertisements because a lot of the things we talk about in class have relevance to things you'll see on television and print ads. And so this week I want to start with just a few ads that I've pulled um, from recent years and then a couple from a while back, just to kind of show you the blatant sexism that exists in media advertisements. And I'm sure that if any of you pulled out any one of the Potter magazines today, you'd see similar ads. So think about doing that as you go along your daily business and see what you can come up with. So I'm not going to talk about these different advertisements, but I'd like for you to look at each of them and think about, just think about how prevalent they are, and maybe you've even seen some of these ads. So think about whether or not you're personally offended by them, and also think about why someone might be offended by them. Okay, so to get us started into some of the content that we want to cover this week, one of the things I think is important to understand is this diagram here on your screen called the gender belief system. Basically what this is showing you is the components of a gender belief system, which include beliefs about gender roles, gender-associated stereotypes, attitude towards women's and men's gender roles, and perceptions of those who violate those roles, including violations based on sexual orientation. So all of these things combined to create a personal gender belief system. So as we go through class this week and you watch some of the different videos and think about some of the materials that we'll be covering, think about what your own gender belief system is and how it's been molded by these various different components. Most of the research about gender stereotypes and gender in general was done in the 1960s and 70s when the women's movement really started to take hold here in the United States. This research focused on looking at the different kinds of stereotypes that typically follow men and women. And basically what we see in these stereotypes is a type of gender polarization, or kind of two opposite extremes. So men are typically seen as agentic, instrumental, which basically means that in men we value, as a society, we value independence, strength, and self-confidence. In women, as a society, we value more communal and expressive traits. We value women who tend to be emotional, helpful, and kind. So this research that began in the 60s and 70s and still continues today really focused on two different kinds of gender stereotypes. The first kind is roles. The first kind is traits, and the second kind is roles. Then there are two other types, physical abilities and cognitive abilities, that we'll also talk about just a little bit. So as you look at these lists, beliefs about women and beliefs about men, these are all related to traits. Think about how true you think this is. Is this really how you think society views men and how society views women? And then as you go through these different lists, also think about what would happen if you were a person who didn't fit would happen if you were a child and you were already being treated toward with gender stereotypes? How would that affect you as a child growing up if you didn't fit those molds? So think about. We're talking about gender stereotyping and we're talking about sexism. We obviously have to talk about feminism. I mentioned the women's rights movement earlier. I think feminism as a whole gets a bad rap. And as social workers, I think it's important to really understand what feminism is all about and to make sure that we ourselves don't stereotype or fall into some kind of trap where we view people who call themselves feminists as bra burners or whatever the case may be. So I pulled a couple of quotes that I think are really important to think about in terms of what feminism really is. The first one says, feminism is the radical notion that women are people. And the second one says, I myself have never been able to find out precisely what feminism is. I only know that people call me a feminist whenever I express sentiments that differentiate me from a doormat. So these are from two different leaders in the women's rights movement, and I think that they are really important in terms of understanding and appreciating the point of feminism. So when someone asks you, are you a feminist, I want you to think twice about it. Think about the implications of saying, no, I'm not a feminist, but I believe in women's rights. What do you think that does for the feminist movement? I personally think it undermines the feminist movement and really does a disservice to women who are trying to stand up for gender diversity and gender rights. So just think about it. Obviously I'm not here to tell you what to think, but I am here to challenge maybe some preconceived notions that you might have had about these different issues. So I just encourage you throughout the semester to just think about where you stand on these different things and really process that for yourself this semester. In terms of the evolution of Ms., I thought this was an interesting story. Actually, also in the 60s and 70s, Ms. was something that really wasn't used. And we had Miss, M-I-S-S, or M-R-S, Mrs. And feminists decided that they wanted to create a term or a title that did not distinguish between married versus unmarried. And so they came up with MS period or Ms. Interestingly enough, though, it's backfired a little bit because more recently, in the 80s and then even in the 90s, MS period became used widely by women who were divorced. So then we had this kind of trifecta, M-I-S-S for Miss, for someone who's single and never been married, MS period or Ms. for someone who has been divorced, and then MRS or Mrs. for someone who's currently married. So interesting kind of how words change and how this abbreviation itself has come to mean many different things in time. Okay, so now maybe you're saying, so what? So what? I hear this about feminism, I hear this about gender stereotyping, who cares, really? And I want to give you a few statistics to think about the real implications and the consequences of what this means in real life. First of all, we know that currently
about that. We know that men make up about 85% of tenured university professors. So when you think of how university faculty positions work, um, a person with a PhD is hired in typically as an assistant professor without tenure. It takes 6 years for that person to work toward tenure. At the end of 6 years, that person submits a portfolio of all of the work they've done in the past 6 years. And then the university, a committee at the university level, decides whether or not that person has been productive enough to be granted tenure. If you're granted tenure, then you are promoted to associate professor, and you can remain at the university indefinitely. So it's kind of job security as well as a prestige factor. If you're not granted tenure, then you're out of a job. You're essentially fired, and you have to go move somewhere else and start over as an assistant professor. So when we look at 85% of tenured university professors being men, we know that there's a good deal of bias in that, in the hiring and tenureship of men versus women. 89% of the membership in the U.S. House and 90% in the U.S. Senate is men. 95% of Fortune 500 CEOs, so the wealthiest companies, CEOs are men, and 99.9%, so all but one, of major athletic professional sports teams owners are men. At the current rate of increase, it'll take about 459 years or so before women are as equally represented at the top of the career ladder, so in management positions, as they are at the bottom in service-oriented roles. I know many of you probably have heard about concepts like sticky floor, glass ceiling, and glass elevator. I want to just kind of clarify those definitions for you. When we think of sticky floor, we're talking about, for example, in this case, women being stuck in lower level positions within a particular company and not really being able to get promoted to higher paying positions despite their length of service and their ability level. When we talk about glass ceiling, we're talking about this invisible kind of barrier that prevents women from reaching the very top levels of management within a company, that they get promoted to a certain point, but then after that point, higher level management positions are reserved for men. And then finally, a glass elevator is a concept related to men that work in predominantly female professions, stereotypically. So we can think of nursing as an example, also teaching, and even social work. When you think about these professions that are predominantly that women predominantly have, we see men in these professions actually being promoted at a much faster rate than women. So there are more men in management kinds of roles and higher paying roles in these fields: nursing, teaching, social work, other female dominated professions. So think about, just as an example, think about school principals and assistant principals. In most cases have traditionally been men, even though this is a teaching field predominated by women. So that's just kind of an example to think about as you go through and think about some of those implications that we don't typically maybe notice on the surface when we think about sexism.